I really don't have too much to explain on this because this is all using all your previous skills to solve trigonometric equations. So your goal is to isolate the variable. So you need to get x all by itself. So to get rid of the sign, you take what's called the arc sign. If you do it to one side, you do it to the other side. So sine and arc sign eliminate each other. I want the angle whose sine is radical 3 over 2. The angle whose sine is radical 3 over 2. Pi over 3, because the sine of pi over 6 is 1/2, means the sine of pi over 3 has to be radical 3 over 2. Now don't forget that it is in, pi over 3 is in the first quadrant, and it is positive, all is positive in the first quadrant, but specifically the sine is. In what other quadrant is the sine or the y value positive? Over here, 2 pi over 3. So either x equals that or x equals 2 pi over 3. Does this ask for all solutions or from 0 to 2 pi? All. So to find all of them, you have to put plus the period for sine and cosine is 2 pi times n. In other words, make a complete circle, you'd be back at the same spot. So plus 2 pi times n. N, by the way, is an element of the integers. In other words, it's 0, 1, 2, 3, things like that. On number 12, we want to get the variable all by itself. So to get rid of tangent, I take the arctangent. Again, if you do it to one side, you have to do it to both sides. The angle whose tangent is 1. Well, that would be pi over 4. Why? Because the tangent of pi over 4 is 1. Sine and cosine have the same value. Tangent is positive here because the cosine and sine have the same sign. Where else is the tangent positive? Down in this quadrant, which is bigger than pi. How much bigger? 1/4. 1/4 bigger than 4/4 would make it 5/4. Again, they want all the solutions, so you have to put plus the period for tangent is not pi, 2 pi. What is the period for tangent? Pi times n. Now, why is it just this first one? If you add pi to pi over 4, where would you be? 5 pi over 4, right? So you can represent this with a single statement. Pi over 4 plus pi times n. Okay, that's 11 and 13. Again, this is from section 5.5. We were doing 11 to 71 odds. So that's what the assignment is going to be. Now let's move on to a different one like 15. To get rid of the cosine, you're going to take the arc cosine. So you're taking the arc cosine or the inverse cosine. Now what is the angle inverse cosine of negative 1/2? Cosine and arc cosine eliminate each other. I want to know cosine of what angle is 1/2? Any pi over 3. You need your trig table, but the cosine of pi over 3 would be 1/2. That's not correct because I don't want it to be 1/2. I want it to be what? Negative 1/2. So that doesn't work. Cosine is the x value. So for the x value to be negative, it has to be in these two quadrants, doesn't it? And if my reference angle is pi over 3, what's 1/3 less than 3/3? And what's 1/3 more than 3/3? So I think my answers would be not pi over 3, but I think might be 2 pi over 3, and what else? 4 pi over 3. Now you have, if I want all of the, if I only want the answer 0 to 2 pi, that would be it. But they want all of them, so you take plus the period, which is 2 pi, times n, which is an integer. Now why couldn't I represent this with a single one?
Because all solutions.
Well, because this angle here is not just adding pi, is it?
No.
And yes, we are finding all solutions, is why we're adding the plus 2 pi n. Okay, I'm going to isolate the variables, so I'm going to subtract 2 sine theta and add 1. And subtract 2 sine theta. So I think that leaves me with 2 sine theta equals 1. Divide by 2 means the sine of theta is 1/2. That means that theta would have to be pi over 6 because the sine of pi over 6 is 1/2. Pi over 6 is in quadrant 1. Everything is positive in quadrant 1. So where else is the sine or the y value positive? I think quadrant 2 has the sine being positive. So 1/6 less than 6/6 would be what? 5/6. Why am I adding the period times n? Because they want all solutions, not just 0 to 2 pi, which is the next few problems. Okay, let's try number 25. This time they want 0 to 2 pi. Where is the sine radical 3 over 2? The sine of what angle is radical 3 over 2? Well, the sine of pi over 6 is 1/2, meaning the sine of pi over 3 is radical 3 over 2. You have to make your angle equal your angle. So basically, 2x has to equal pi over 3. Where else does this occur? Where else is the sine positive, the y value positive? I think it would be in this quadrant with the same reference angle. So 2x might equal 2 pi over 3. If you multiply by 1/2, that gives you the solution for x to be pi over 6. If you multiply by 1/2, that gives me 2/6 or 1/3. Now neither of those are bigger than 2 pi, so I have to continue. So if I add 2 pi, if I add 6/3 to 1/3, what would I have? 7/3. So 2x has to equal 7/3. Or what if I added 2 pi to 2/3? If I added 6/3 to 2/3, what would that make it? 8/3? So you make your 2x equal 8/3 pi. Multiply by 1/2 makes it into 7/6 pi. Multiplying this by 1/2, 2 goes into 8 4 times. Now I'm getting bigger than pi, but I don't think I'm bigger than 2 pi yet. So I'm going to keep going. One more time. If I added 2 pi, which is 6/3, 6/3 to 7/3, would that make 13/3? So I have to make my angle 2x equal 13/3. What else would 2x have to equal? If I added 6/3 to 8/3, what would that give me? That would be what? 14/3? 14/3. Now if I multiply by 1/2, that makes this into 13/6, isn't it? which is bigger than 2 pi, isn't it? So these I don't really need. I believe it's just those 4 answers. Okay, after 25, we're still doing 0 to 2 pi. Where is the cosine radical 3 over 2? Cosine of what angle is radical 3 over 2? Because that's what 4x would have to equal, as long as it's negative. Cosine of what is radical 3 over 2? I'm asking one more time.
Let me check. 5
Pi over 6, right? Because the sine of pi over 6 is 1/2, making the cosine of pi over 6 radical 3 over 2. But that's not negative. In what quadrant is the cosine or the x value negative? Second and third. So what angles am I concerned with?
5 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6.
Perfect. 5 pi over 6, 7 pi over 6. So make this equal 5 pi over 6, and make this equal 7 pi over 6. Multiply by 1/4, and that would be 5 pi over 24. Multiply by 1/4 would be 7 pi over 24. Now we got to keep going because I got to go bigger between 0 and 2 pi on this one. So if I added 2 pi to 5/6, if I added 12/6 to 5/6, what would that make it? Would that be 17/6? And if I added 12/6 to 7/6, would that make 19/6? Multiply by 1/4 makes it into 17 pi over 24. Multiply by 1/4 makes this 19 pi over 24. I'm still not bigger than 2 pi, so I continue. Okay, if I added 12/6 or 2 pi to 17/6, what would I have? 29/6. Why can I probably stop right here? What do you get if you multiply by 1/4? 29/24. Is that right? So I guess I'm still going. That's not bigger than 2 pi yet, is it? So I got to keep going. I'm sorry. How about the other one? If I added 12/4 to 19/4, what would that give me? 31/4. Multiply by 1/4 makes 31/24. Noticing the denominators are 24ths, what's 2 pi? 48/24. Am I at 48/24 yet? No, so I'm going to keep going. This time when I add 2 pi, I bet it gets bigger at some point. What's 12/6 plus 29/6?
42.
Is it 41/6?
Not bad.
And how about the next one? If I added 12/6 to 31/6, I don't know why I put fourths.
43.
Should give me what? 43/6. And when you multiply by 1/4, what do I get? 41 pi over 24. What does this give me? 43 pi over 24. And I bet that's it, because anything bigger is probably going to give me something bigger than 48/24, which is 2 pi. Okay, let's look at 35. 35 is 0 to 2 pi. Secant is reciprocal of cosine. So I could write it as a cosine as long as I do the reciprocal. The cosine of what angle is 1/2? I believe the cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2. Now the cosine is the x value. It's negative in these two quadrants, so I don't want pi over 3. I think I want the reference angle to be pi over 3, so that's 2/3 and 4/3, correct? So I take my angle, which is what? 3 theta over 2. I make it equal the angle of 2/3 pi, 3 theta over 2, and make it equal 4/3 pi. If you multiply by the reciprocal, which would be what? 3 over 2? So if I take this times 3 over 2, and same thing here, times 3 over 2. What is that going to, I'm sorry, 2 over 3, right? I want to multiply by the reciprocal, which I believe would be 2 over 3. That would get rid of the 3/2, leaving me the theta equals 4 pi over 9, I think. And here would be 8 pi over 9, top times top, bottom times bottom. Now, if I continued, because this again wants all your answers between 0 and 2 pi, I'm going to take my 3 theta over 2 and make it equal the next increment. In other words, add 2 pi. If you have 2 pi over 3 and you're adding 2 pi or 6/3, what does that give me? 8 pi over 3. If I took 4/3 and I added 6/3, what would that give me? 10 pi over 3. And again, I need to solve this, so I'm going to multiply both sides by the reciprocal of 3 over 2, which is 2 over 3. 2 over 3. What does that make theta equal then? Would that be 16/9? Top times top, bottom times bottom. And how about this one? Would this be 20 pi over 9? Okay. Why don't I use 20 pi over 9? It's bigger than 2 pi. Do I use 16 over 9? Yes, because that's smaller than 2 pi. So there should be 3 answers on 35. Okay, I guarantee you'll get ones that are trinomials like this one. To get 2 sine squared, you might have to do 2 sine of x times the sine of x, which gives you 2 sine squared. Remember, it's a y squared plus by plus c. I don't want to use x because there's already x's there. But anyway, what's a times c? -2. What's b? -1. Do these multiply to -2 and add to -1? Connect your outsides and the insides, and I'm going to say 2 goes into which of these numbers? 2 goes into the -2 and the 1 here. So 2 times what is -2? 2 times what is -2? -1. How about here? 1 times what is 1? 1 times what is 1? 1 times a positive 1. If you make this equal 0, and I subtract 1 and divide by 2, I'm looking for where the sine of x is. The sine is -1/2. The sine of what angle is 1/2? Pi over 6. But I don't want it to be positive 1/2. I want it negative. If the y or the sine is negative, it's either here at 7/6 or over here at 11/6. sixth. So I have two answers for that. Again, I want all my answers 0 to 2 pi, which those work. Also, what makes this 0? Well, the sine of x minus 1 equals 0. That happens when the sine is 1. And where is the sine 1?
1.
Well, you can think of what the sine curve looks like. I believe at pi over 2. Or you could look at a unit circle and realize at pi over 2 up here, what is the coordinates of the unit circle? 0, 1, cosine sine. So the sine would be 1 at pi over 2. So I believe this one to have 3 answers. Okay, how about 43? Again, I probably need to make it equal 0. So what am I going to do? I'm going to subtract sine x, subtract 3, and then it should equal 0. Then I'm going to factor it. Again, many times a trinomial factors into the product of two binomials. So to get 2 sine squared, you have to have 2 sine times sine. In this case, a times c is negative 6 and b is negative 1, which I think you use these because they multiply to negative 6 and add to negative 1. 2 goes into the 2, and here's the negative 3. So again, 2 times what is 2? 2 times 1 is 2. 1 times what is negative 3? 1 times what is negative 3? Well, that'd be a negative 3. Now I have 2 things multiplied equaling 0, which means one of these has to equal 0. Do you know that if you add 3 and divide by 2, what would you have? You'd have to add the 3 and then divide by 2. If I have sine x plus 1 equals 0 and I subtracted 1, you'd get this. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. There is no value where the sine is 3 over 2. 3 over 2 is 1.5. What's the biggest that a sine wave goes to? 1. So it never gets that big. This one does not have a solution on the left. However, where is the sine negative 1? You could think of a unit circle. Sine is a y value. 0, negative 1, cosine sine. So would that be at 3 pi over 2? And I think this one might only have the one answer because the others did not work. Okay, after 43, somebody asked 51. Sometimes something equals 0 means one of these has to equal 0. So for 53, you know the tangent x minus 1 has to equal 0. If you add 1, means the tangent is 1. That happens at pi over 4. Where else is the tangent positive? 1 and 3. So that's bigger than pi. So I think you'd also have 5/4. Now on your other one here, you have cosine of x plus 1 equals 0. Cosine of x, therefore, would be negative 1. Where does that occur? Where is the x value negative 1? Well, I think it'd be over here on the unit circle, negative 1, 0. Cosine sine, and that's a pi, right? So I think this one's going to be x equals pi. This one wants our answer between 0 and 2 pi, but it does not include 2 pi. So I believe it would be these 3. Okay, 53. How about 59? Look for common factors. Do these both have a sine of x? So if I factored a sine of x out, this is 1 plus 2 cosine of x. Now again, I said there's really not much to teach in this section because it's all of your algebraic equation solving skills mixed together with your trig skills. If something times something equals 0, I make it equal 0. If the sine of x is 0, that happens at 0 and at pi. It also happens at 2 pi, but I think I only want my answers between, not including 2 pi. So I believe these would work there. Now what makes this other one 0 is when the cosine of x is negative 1/2. That happens not at pi over 3. The cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2. But I need the cosine to be negative. That means the x value is negative. So it's not 1/3. What would it be? 2/3 pi and 4/3 pi, right? So you might have 2/3 pi and 4/3 pi. And I believe these should be your answers. Anything bigger is going to be bigger than 2 pi. Okay, 59, again, you had to look for common factors and then set each factor equal to 0 and solve. Now, I'd imagine it's similar with this one, but notice you have sines and cosines mixed. May I recommend that we get them all either to sines or all to cosines? I notice that this has a sine. I probably, therefore, should change this into sine. 2 cosine squared. Is it 2 times, what could I call cosine squared?
1 minus sine squared.
1 minus sine squared. So if I distribute that 2, what does this give me? 2 minus 2 sine squared plus sine of x minus 1 equals 0. Could I move everything over to the right-hand side? Would that be 2x squared minus sine x and then minus 1, I believe? Because 2 minus 1 is 1, but I needed to subtract it to the other side. I don't know why I have 2x squared. It should be 2 what? 2 sine squared of x. And then I subtracted the sine of x, and I subtracted the 1. So hopefully it factors this way. To get 2 sine squared means 2 sine times sine. What is A times C on this? That's not a good color. How about this one? What is A times C? Negative 2. What's B? Negative 1. Do these multiply to negative 2 and add to negative 1? So 2 goes into the negative 2, and here is the 1. So 2 times what is 2? 2 times what is negative 2, that is? Negative 1. 1 times what is 1? 1 times 1 is 1. Set them both equal to 0 means that the sine of x equals negative 1/2. That's where, not at pi over 6, I need the sine to be negative. So that means a y, I think it would be what? 7 pi over 6 and 11 pi over 6. That would be my two angles down in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. Now how about if the one makes this equal 0 is when the sine of x equals 1. Where does the sine of x equal 1? I believe at pi over 2. Think about the unit circle, cosine sine, 0, 1, and where is that occurring at? Pi over 2, that is, pi over 2. So anyway, I hopefully have 3 answers on number 63. So this here could be called cosine squared minus sine squared, but I don't want that because I want them all in cosines. So what might I use? Cosine of 2x equaling something else. Cosine of 2x. Is it 2 cosine squared minus 1, or is it 1 minus 2 cosine squared? One of these, I might have them reversed, but let's check them. It also could be cosine squared minus sine squared. Yeah, so I think I'm going to use this very top one, 2 cosine squared minus 1 for this. So this is 2 cosine squared minus 1. This is going to equal cosine. If I subtract the cosine over to make it equal 0, it would be like this. So now I want to factor this trinomial, most likely into the product of two binomials. What's a times c on this one? A times c is negative 2. And what's b? So negative 2 times 1. If you've done enough of them. 2 times what is negative 2? And 1 times what is 1? If I make this equal 0, I get cosine of x to equal negative 1/2. And where does that occur at? Cosine is 1/2 at pi over 3. But I don't want pi over 3 because everything's positive in that quadrant. I want the cosine or the x to be negative. 2 pi over 3 and 4 pi over 3. So you have 2 pi over 3 and you have 4 pi over 3. How about this one? If you make this equal 0, cosine of x would equal 1. That happens at 0. Why don't I use 2 pi? Because your interval includes 0, but it does not include 2 pi.